Now, Martin Luther King Jr. is the most visible and probably the most important leader of the civil rights movement. He was dedicated to winning the civil rights through nonviolent action. He's born in January 1929, the year of the stock market crash in Atlanta, Georgia. He attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, and then Boston University, where he received his PhD. Later, Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a Baptist minister. From 1955 until he's assassinated in 1968, Martin Luther King would be the most visible civil rights leader. He first became famous leading the Montgomery bus boycott, which we've kind of talked about. In November 1961, he went to Georgia for something called the Albany Campaign. In that month, a federal agency ordered all interstate travel facilities to desegregate, and SNCC helped students in Albany, Georgia to test to see if the South would respect these new rules. Protesters in Albany also demonstrated at movie theaters, libraries, schools, and City Hall. But many of them are arrested and progress is not being made. The South does not follow what the court says it has to do. So the man in charge in Albany, Dr. William G. Anderson, he's president of this thing called the Albany Movement. He asked Martin Luther King to come to Albany and help them out. So Martin Luther King Jr. comes with his organization. It's known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was just a group he formed in 1957 with other black ministers. Their goal is to end the segregation of all sorts throughout the South. So Martin Luther King Jr. goes to Albany. He gets arrested, but he basically faces a different kind of law enforcement officer in Albany. The chief of police was a guy named Laurie Pritchett, and he basically studied the tactics of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr.'s tactics. Pritchett tried to avoid scenes of police brutality and mass arrests. He knew that this only played into the hands of civil rights activists. He had calculated how many people his jails could hold and the jails in nearby cities and counties. So he knew just how many protesters he could arrest so as not to overfill his jails and then be forced to give in to the protesters' demands when he can't arrest anymore. What ends up happening is the Albany movement fails. A judge issues a restraining order to end the demonstrations. Martin Luther King can't get John F. Kennedy to take action, so he ends up leaving Albany feeling that he failed. But then he goes to Birmingham, Alabama, and this is where he has one of his biggest successes. Birmingham is one of the most segregated places in America. It's also called Bombingham. That was its nickname because there is so many bombings that had gone unsolved. Now, Birmingham's police were led by Theophilus Eugene Connor, also known as Bull Connor. On April 3rd, 1963, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference launched something called Project C. Basically, protesters start to demonstrate against segregation in Birmingham. They're promptly arrested, but Bull Connor is careful to show restraint while arresting protesters. But things start going downhill quickly. On April 10th, the city of Birmingham obtained a state court injunction that ordered an end to the demonstrations. So basically the courts tell the blacks to stop demonstrating against segregation. Martin Luther King Jr. doesn't know what to do, so he just decides to go out and join the protesters and march himself. This ends up getting him arrested. And while he's in jail, a group of white clergymen write a letter, and basically they acknowledge that injustices exist in Birmingham and in America, but at the same time, they condemned outside agitators like King coming in and stirring up trouble. They tell him to wait. Civil rights will be on their way. This is when King writes his famous Letters from a Birmingham Jail. Basically, he said, when you tell black people to wait for civil rights patiently, it really means waiting forever for something that will not be realized or will never happen. So that's why King says why we have to protest now. There's no waiting. So King's let out of jail just over a week after being arrested. And once out, he makes a controversial decision to use children in the demonstration. So these are younger children all the way up to high school age. On May 2nd, some 700 children are arrested as they demonstrate in the city of Birmingham. The next day, May 3rd, Bull Connor brings out fire hoses and police dogs, and these are the pictures and the scenes that everybody kind of recognizes. The violence is captured on camera and shown to the nation, and I want you to watch a few clips of this. Blacks start to show up to demonstrations with weapons. There's fear that rioting and open clashes between protesters and police might break out. By Monday, May 4th, about 2,500 people had been arrested. 2,000 of these were children. On May 10th, though, an agreement is reached between the protesters and the business community of Birmingham. They agree to desegregate things like lunch counters and drinking fountains. The business community also promises to hire more blacks to work in their stores. So it's kind of seen as a success. Now, there is some trouble, though. Martin Luther King's hotel is bombed the day after this agreement is reached. He's not there. He's not hurt. Blacks show up to kind of see what happened, and the police start to beat them with their clubs and their rifles, and their rioting basically follows. So more violence happens after an agreement is reached. But there's success overall. On June 11th, George Wallace, he's governor of Alabama. He takes his famous stand in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to try to prevent integration. He had become infamous for his January 1963 inauguration speech, in which he said, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Here's a clip of that.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Let us send this message back to Washington by our representatives who are here with us today, that from this day we are standing up, and the heel of tyranny does not fit the neck of an upright man, that we intend to take the offensive and carry our fight for freedom across this nation, wielding the balance of power we know we possess in the Southland, that we, not the insipid block voters of some sections, will determine in the next election who shall sit in the White House of these United States.
Amidst all of this, JFK finally takes action. On June 11th, he addresses the nation. He says, "Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that not city or state legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south, where legal remedies are not at hand. Next week, I shall ask Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century, to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law." Later that night, civil rights activist Medgar Evers, who had helped James Meredith attend the University of Mississippi, he's assassinated at his home in Jackson, Mississippi. In September of that year, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama is bombed. This is where 4 black girls are killed in that bombing. So there's still violence that happens after the Birmingham campaign. So JFK, in the summer of 1963, calls for Congress to pass civil rights legislation. But the civil rights leaders don't necessarily trust Kennedy, so they call for a march on Washington. This March on Washington is officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It takes place on August 28th, 1963. Now, JFK and his brother Robert did not want this march to take place. They didn't really like the civil rights movement agitating for freedom, for an end to discrimination. They thought it made their job more difficult. But the march does take place, and some 250,000 people attend it. Asa Philip Randolph had proposed a march like this back in 1941 during FDR's presidency, but FDR convinced him not to hold the march because World War II was on the horizon. Now, the high point of this civil rights movement maybe is this March on Washington. MLK gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech during this March on Washington. Now, so JFK has called for civil rights legislation. Civil rights activists march on Washington to put pressure on Congress to pass it. But JFK does not live to see a civil rights bill signed into law. He's assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd. But his successor, LBJ, would use his death to call for passage of civil rights law. This, along with the work of the civil rights movement, especially the Birmingham campaign and the March on Washington, resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. LBJ signed this into law on July 2nd, 1964. It banned racial discrimination in privately run accommodations for the public. It authorized the Attorney General to eliminate legal segregation in things like public schools, hospitals, etc. Schools could lose federal funding if they continued to discriminate. The law also forbade discrimination in employment and specified the category of sex in addition to race, color, religion, and national origin. It also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Though there would be much more accomplished in the coming years regarding civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a major step forward. Now in 1964, something called the Freedom Summer takes place. There's a huge drive to register people to vote in Mississippi. The Freedom Summer brought people from all over the country to Ohio, and that's where they trained, and then they went to Mississippi to register people to vote. There were 3 activists, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. They were murdered down in Mississippi trying to register blacks to vote. They went missing on June 21st. There's a massive search for them. LBJ sent in federal authorities to help find their bodies. Their bodies are discovered in August of that year outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. Their bodies had been buried in a dam. They had been shot to death. A month after LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act is when this occurs. Now, nobody was ever charged with the murders, although some Mississippi police and other officials were charged at the federal level with violating the 3 civil rights, and they were sent to prison. During this Freedom Summer, something called the Mississippi Freedom Democrat Party was created. This was an alternative Democrat party, so this is basically a Democrat party that black people start. The party registered some 60,000 people, and they tried to represent the Democrat Party from Mississippi at the 1964 National Convention, but they were basically ignored. Okay. Now, another kind of campaign that took place was the Selma campaign in January to March of 1965. So throughout 1964, SNCC had been working on registering voters in Dallas County, Alabama. In January 1965, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC got together and launched an effort aimed at getting people registered to vote in Selma, Alabama. Less than 1% of blacks in Dallas County were registered to vote. Civil rights activists faced off against Sheriff Jim Clark. He was the sheriff of Dallas County. He liked to dress up almost as a military figure. He had a helmet and an army-looking jacket. He was an unrepentant segregationist. He wore a button on his lapel that said never, so basically we'll never end desegregation. Sheriff Clark often kept blacks out of the courthouse when they would show up to register. At one point, he arrested Mrs. Amelia Boynton, who was this respected leader in the black community. Reverend C.T. Vivian at one point confronted Sheriff Clark on the steps of the courthouse, and he was met with violence. I want you to watch this.
The Teachers' March was the first black middle-class demonstration in Selma. Cheyenne Webb and Rachel West were school children at the time.
And it was amazing to see how many teachers had participated. I remember vividly on that day when I saw my teachers marching with me, you know, just for the right to vote.
And it was, teachers then was somewhat like up in the upper class, you know. People look up to teachers then and look up to preachers. They were somewhat like leaders for us back then.
Then the undertakers got a group and they marched. The beauticians got a group, they marched. Everybody marched after teachers marched because teachers had more influence than they ever dreamed in the community.
And we want you to know, gentlemen, that every one of you, see, we know your badge numbers, we know your names.
In mid-February, Reverend C.T. Vivian, an SCLC organizer, confronted Sheriff Clark and his deputies on the courthouse steps.
But believe me, there were those that followed Hitler, like you blindly follow this Sheriff Clark, who didn't think their day would come. But they also were pulled into the courtrooms, and they were also given their death sentences. You're not this bad a racist, but you're racist in the same way that Hitler was a racist. And you're blindly following a man that's leading you down a road that's going to bring you into federal court. Now, I am representing people in Dallas County, and I have that right to do so. Now, and as I represent them, and they can speak for themselves, is what I'm saying true? Yes. Is it what you think and what you believe? Yes. Boy, this is not a local problem, gentlemen. This is a national problem. You can't keep anyone in the United States from voting without hurting the rights of all other citizens. Democracy's built on this. This is why every man has the right to vote, regardless.
And he started shouting at me that I was a Hitler, I was a brute, that I was a Nazi. I don't remember everything he called me. And I did lose my temper then.
And we have come to be here because they are registering at this time.
Turn that
And so
light
we
out.
have
I'm gonna
come,
shoot it out.
and
It's
we have
finding
come
me
to
and I
register.
can't enforce the law with light in my
We
face.
have come to register. And this is our reason for being here. We're not
You're
demonstrating.
blinding me with that light.
We're not.
Move back.
Well, no, you can arrest us, Bob. Hey, don't keep that man. You don't keep that man. You want to arrest us? You don't have to beat us. No, you don't have to beat us.
I don't remember even hitting him, but I went to the doctor and got an x-ray and found out I had a linear fracture and a finger on my left hand.
With Jim Clark, it was a clear engagement between the forces of movement and the forces of the structure that would destroy movement. It was a clear engagement between those who wished the fullness of their personalities to be met and those that would destroy us physically and psychologically. You do not walk away from that. This is what movement meant. Movement meant that finally we were encountering on a mass scale the evil that had been destroying us on a mass scale. You do not walk away from that. You continue to answer it.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us?
Why don't you get out in front of the camera and go on?
It's not a matter of being in front of the camera. It's a matter of facing your sheriff and facing your judge. We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote. You beat me in the side and then hide your blows. Go on. I don't need to leave. We've come to register to vote. Hey, everybody under arrest! Let's all go! You must arrest me!
I'm here to tell you tonight that the businessmen, the mayor of this city, the police commissioner of this city, and everybody in the white power structure of this city must take a responsibility for everything that Jim Clark does in this community.
Now, while the drive was going on in Selma, there was a march held at nearby Marion, Alabama in February of 1965. And in that march, a black man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, was killed by an Alabama state trooper. He was shot and then died several days later. This killing led SNCC to propose a symbolic march from Selma to Montgomery. This was a distance of 54 miles. The march begins on Sunday, March 7th, but Governor Wallace opposed the march, and he told state troopers to prevent it from taking place. As marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were attacked by the police in what came to be known as Bloody Sunday. I have a clip of this I want you to watch.
It's a matter of facing your sheriff. The right to be in this court. Come on, let's go. We have the right to be in this court. This courtroom belongs to all the citizens of this county. We have the right to be here and will not in any way be interfering with the pursuit of traffic.
To be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You are to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue. Troopers here, advance toward the group. See that they disperse.
The TV network showed the attack. Alabama authorities tried to prevent the march from taking place. LBJ intervened and met with Governor George Wallace and implored him to protect the marchers. LBJ gave a speech on national TV to a joint session of Congress, and he called for a voting rights bill to pass Congress. Blacks called for people to come to Selma from all over the country. Thousands show up, and eventually they're allowed to march. In all, something like 25,000 people marched. But one thing that comes out of this Selma March was the breakup of the Civil Rights Coalition. Martin Luther King is still committed to nonviolence, but many within SNCC, which is led by Stokely Carmichael, they begin to preach black power as opposed to freedom and nonviolence, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Now, following the Selma March came the biggest civil rights legislation of 1965. This is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. LBJ signs this into law in August of 1965. Basically, in parts of the South, many blacks were not registered, as we kind of have seen. In some parts of the Deep South, 90% or more of blacks are not registered to vote. So LBJ ends up signing this law, and Selma really pushed the nation towards signing this law. John L. Lewis, who was a leader of SNCC, he had said when the protesters at Selma were beaten up at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, he said, "I don't see how President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam and can't send troops to Selma." So basically, how can you send troops to protect people's freedom overseas, but you can't protect our freedom here at home? When LBJ signed this Voting Rights Act into law, he said this: "Let me say to every Negro in this country, you must register, you must vote. The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls that imprison men because they are different from other men." So the Voting Rights Act greatly extended federal power in the nation. It took aim especially at the Deep South. It stipulated that the Justice Department could intervene to suspend discriminatory registration tests in counties where 50% or fewer of the country's voting age population was registered. If this intervention failed, the federal government could send in its own registrars to take over the job. The law covers federal, state, and local elections, and the law works. Within a year, black voter registration in 6 southern states rose from 30 to 46%. By 1967, more than 50% of voting age blacks had the franchise in the 6 most discriminatory states in the South. Now, just because civil rights laws were passed did not mean there was not a lack of racial tension or violence in the country. Just after LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Watts riot broke out in Los Angeles. The causes of the Watts riot were many. There was high unemployment in the black community. Something like 75% of adult black men did not have jobs. There had been years of mistreatment, and there was an altercation between police and a black man who resisted arrest for driving drunk, and this kind of starts the riots. During these Watts riots, it's 5 days of rioting and looting. Almost 14,000 National Guardsmen were required to restore order. When it was all said and done, 34 people were killed and more than 1,000 injured. Property damage was something like $35 million. Over 4,000 people were arrested. Later in the summer of 1967, there were more massive riots all across the nation. That year saw over 150 cities see riots. 33 of these riots required state police to intervene, and 8 required sending in the National Guard or federal troops. The biggest riots were in Detroit and Newark. The riot in Detroit lasted 5 days. 43 people were killed and $50 million in property damage occurred. Governor George Romney had to call in the National Guard, some 7,000 soldiers who battled rioters and looters in the streets. Cars were torched. Buildings are set on fire. Firemen received sniper fire as they tried to put out the flames. LBJ later sends in the 101st and 82nd Airborne, something like 4,700 federal troops to stop the rioting. The riot in Newark, New Jersey leaves 23 dead. After these riots in 1967, LBJ appoints something called the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. It's led by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner, and it released its report a year later. So in 1968, the Kerner Commission publishes a report that basically says America is becoming two societies, kind of the haves and the have-nots. Okay, I said we'd kind of talk about how civil rights started to break apart. And that's when you have the emergence of the Black Power movement. So as the 1960s progress, some blacks within the civil rights movement feel that changing laws is not enough to ensure that their civil rights are protected. They begin to call for blacks to gain power, political power, to protect themselves. So we need black mayors, governors, school board members, etc. Now, along with the call for black power came a rejection of MLK's practice of nonviolence. Now, this doesn't mean that proponents of black power preached violence necessarily. A good way to think of it is they said they were often opposed to violence but supported self-defense, whereas Martin Luther King kind of said turn the other cheek. Black power maybe says don't turn the other cheek, stick up for yourself. Some blacks within the Black Power movement also began to reject kind of Christianity and an appeal to their American culture and values. So far, the civil rights movement, the backbone has been the black church and the black pastor, but that starts to change. King constantly invoked the teachings of Jesus and appealed to the founding principles of America in his crusade to win equal treatment. But some blacks start to look towards Africa and even Islam to kind of find their identity. One of these people is Malcolm X. Now, he's born Malcolm Little. He's born in Nebraska. He gets involved in a life of drugs and crime. But in prison, he's introduced to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. He's the one that is promoting the Nation of Islam. So Malcolm X, after learning from Elijah Muhammad, joins the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam is a religious group that taught black pride. It establishes schools and mosques throughout America. It promotes black businesses. In 1963, Malcolm X becomes the national spokesman for the Nation of Islam. In 1965, he publishes the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I have a clip here of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. that I want you to watch.
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this American white man. And they have proved it throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 years ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they have taken off the white sheet and put on police uniforms. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully, today Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Uncle Tom who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the face of the attack of the Klan in that
well,
day.
I don't think of love as, in this context, as emotional bosh. I don't think of it as a weak force. But I think of love as something strong and that organizes itself into powerful direct action. Now, this is what I tried to teach in the struggle in the South, that we are not engaged in a struggle that means we sit down and do nothing. That there's a great deal of difference between non-resistance to evil and non-violent resistance. Non-resistance leaves you in a state of stagnant passivity and deadened complacency, wherein non-violent resistance means that you do resist in a very strong and determined manner. And I think some of the criticisms of nonviolence, or some of the critics, fail to realize that we are talking about something very strong, and they confuse non-resistance with non-violence.
The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to give Negroes a chance to sit in a segregated restaurant beside the same white man who had brutalized them for 400 years. The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to get Negroes to forgive the people who have brutalized them for 400 years by lulling them to sleep and making them forgetting what those whites have done to them. But the masses of black people in America today don't go for what Martin Luther King is putting down. As you said in one of your articles, it's psychologically insecure, or something of that sort. I forget how you put it. But you didn't endorse what Martin Luther King was doing yourself.
I do not reject his goals of full integration and full equality rights for American citizens. Do you reject these goals?
If you don't think that he's walking on the right road, I'm quite sure you don't agree that he'll get to the right place. And if you would classify his method as psychologically unrealistic, I think that if a man's method is psychologically unrealistic, which means the road or the means or the method that he's using, I think as a psychologist, you'd be very doubtful
I don't think
that he would reach
true.
the right.
If anyone has ever lived with a nonviolent movement in the South, from Montgomery on through the Freedom Rides and through the sit-in movement and the recent Birmingham movement, and see the reactions of many of the extremists and reactionaries in the white community, he wouldn't say that this movement makes, or this philosophy makes him comfortable. I think it arouses a sense of shame within him often, in many instances. I think it does something to touch the conscience and establish a sense of guilt. Now, so often people respond to guilt by engaging more in the guilt-evoking act in an attempt to drown the sense of guilt. But this approach certainly doesn't make the white man feel comfortable. I think it does the other thing, conscience, and it disturbs this sense of contentment.
Nothing will they ever do. They will always talk it, but they won't practice it. And with the Supreme Court, if the NAACP can tell me that they want a desegregation decision for me 10 years ago, but yet the schools haven't been desegregated, as I say, this is a victory with no victory. It's a victory that you can talk about, but it's a victory you can't show me. So if you represent the NAACP and you're telling me about this great victory you won for me, when I look at you, I have to conclude that either you have been duped yourself or else you are trying to dupe me. And in most instances where the civil rights struggle is involved, there is no civil rights leader can point to me one concrete gain, practical gain, that black people have made in the civil rights field in this country, not only during the past 10 years, but during the past 100 years.
I don't think there's any real organization to the riots. I think they grow out of the conditions that I've mentioned all along. And as long as these intolerable conditions are there, as long as the Negro finds himself living every day in a major depression, then every city will sit on a powder keg and can explode over the slightest incident. I feel that killing is a very tragic way to deal with any social problem. There is no violent solution to the problem that the Negro confronts in this country. And this is why I have constantly said that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. After all, the Negro ends up on the losing end. We can't win a violent revolution. Most of the persons killed in riots are Negroes themselves. The persons who end up not being able to get milk for their children of Negroes because things where they have to live are destroyed. So there's no practical or moral answer in the realm of violence to the Negro's problem. But I do understand the sociological, the psychological, and the economic reasons.
The problem can be solved. First, the white man and the black man have to be able to sit down at the same table. The white man has to feel free to speak his mind without hurting the feelings of that Negro. And the so-called Negro has to feel free to speak his mind without hurting the feelings of the white man. Then they can bring the issues that are under the rug out on top of the table and take an intelligent approach to get the problem solved. That's the only way that they'll ever do it. We need an action program while we are Muslims, or while we are Christians, or while we are whatever we are. We still need an action program that will eliminate these evils that are in our community. And this is what we're trying to do with the Muslim Mosque Incorporated.
Do you consider yourself militant?
I consider myself Malcolm.
Well, I think have to agree that this appears to be the result of an internal conflict within the black nationalist movement. So I think the first thing that needs to be done is for a conference of goodwill to take place between black nationalist leaders. This was why I suggested a few days ago that the followers of the late Malcolm X and the followers of Elijah Muhammad should sit down at the peace table together, so to speak, and discuss this problem and try to reach some understanding. I don't think, and I'm sure, that nothing can be accomplished by violence. It only leads to new and more complex social problems. I think it is unfortunate for the black nationalist movement. I think it is unfortunate for the health of our nation.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish. But Beyonce had one of the best videos of all time.
Now Malcolm X traveled to the Middle East twice during his life. On one trip he went to a pilgrimage to Mecca and he became an Orthodox Muslim. Eventually he had a falling out with the Nation of Islam. He started his own group, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was dedicated to black nationalism. And when Malcolm X talked about black nationalism, this is what he meant. He said the black man should control the politics of his own community and control the politicians who are in his own community. He said the black man should have a hand in controlling the economy of the so-called Negro community. So basically, control your politics, control your economic destiny. Now, Malcolm X is assassinated in February 1965 while giving a speech in New York City. He was assassinated by some members of the Nation of Islam. Now, another Black Power advocate was Cassius Clay. Cassius Clay became famous for his boxing skills, winning an Olympic gold medal in 1960 and defeating Sonny Liston in February 1964 for the heavyweight champion of the world. After becoming famous, Cassius Clay changed his name to Cassius X, and then after that he converted to Islam and changed his name to Muhammad Ali. The reason he gave was that Cassius Clay was his slave name. It was a white name, and Muhammad Ali was his free name, his black name, and this is where he says that.
Hey, tell me how you came to get such a Roman name as that.
Well, as I understand, I'm Cassius Marcellus Clay VI, and my great-great-grandfather was a Kentucky slave, and he was named after some great Kentuckian. Well, Cassius Marcellus Clay is a great name in Kentucky. And really, where he was from or where it was all originated, I couldn't tell you. But since I've reached a little fame in boxing, most people want to know where am I from and where did I get that name. But really, I haven't really checked on it. So I see that I'm going to have to go look into
You'll have to look it up.
See what it's all about now that I'm getting a little interviews. Yeah.
How did you come to take up boxing?
Well, I started about 6 years ago. My bicycle was stolen, and my cousin was a boxer. He wasn't too successful, but he boxed. And he told me that he would train me if I ever catch the guy that, you know how kids think, if I ever caught the guy that stole my bicycle, well, he would, I would know how to fight, you know, I could defend myself. Well, anyway, he took me to the gym, and he quit later, but I kept it up.
Why don't you like to be called Clay anymore?
No, Clay was not my name. Once we follow, believe, hear, understand the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and come into knowledge of ourselves, then we want to be called after names of our people, which are names that fit us black people. And Clay was a white man's name. It was a slave name. And I'm no longer Clay. I'm no longer a slave. So now I'm Muhammad Ali.
Do you answer to Clay anymore?
Well, some people, they still say Clay.
Sports writers still call you Clay.
No, I stopped them because they know better. But some people who don't know better, they say, how you doing, Mr. Clay? I may not say nothing because the intention was nice. It didn't mean no harm. Then some walk up How you doing, boy? How you feeling, Cassius? Meet Mr. Clay, fine boy. Then I have to straighten him out because he's agitating and acting smart and bossy. But it's according to how they approach me.
Now, Muhammad was the prophet and the founder of Islam, and Ali was his son-in-law and the first caliph. But according to Islam, Muhammad was a white man and a slave owner. Here's a picture of Muhammad al-Yaqubi. This is the 34th grandson of Muhammad. You can see he's obviously white. According to Islamic traditions in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, Muhammad was a white man. He had a white complexion. His hair was white. He was white with an elegant face. Other sources, Islamic sources, tell us that Muhammad had white shins and white thighs and white legs. He had a white stomach and white forearms, white armpits and white cheeks. There's a lot of talk within the Islamic sources about talking about how Muhammad was white and how he was not a black person. According to Islam, Muhammad also owned over 36 slaves. He named one of his slaves, gave him a name of like Ship. Basically, he carries stuff for me. What else? Muhammad and his son-in-law Ali had sex slaves. They would capture a village. They would sell the men into slavery, then take women as sex slaves, or they would sell the women and children into slavery to buy weapons. So when they go conquer the next village, Al-Tabari, a Muslim historian from shortly after the time of Muhammad, talked about how Muhammad handed out slave girls to his followers. So basically, when Cassius Clay took the name Muhammad Ali, he was taking the name of two Muslim Arabs who owned and traded in black slaves and had sex with slave girls they had captured in warfare. But his original name, Cassius Clay, he was named after Cassius Marcellus Clay, a 19th century abolitionist. Now, Clay inherited slaves from his father, but then he freed them. He donated money and land to build Berea College, which was a multiracial college. Clay was the target of assassination attempts because of his calls to end slavery. He was once shot in the chest at a public debate, but he actually survived the assassination attempt, and he actually attacked the assassin with a Bowie knife and cut out his eye. He was later jumped by 6 brothers, but he fought them off and killed one of them with his Bowie knife, so this is a tough dude. Clay published an anti-slavery newspaper called True American. He received death threats because of his newspaper. He actually had cannon in his printing office, so if anyone came to take his printing press away, he was going to shoot him with a cannon. Lincoln appointed him as U.S. ambassador to Russia. When he was in Russia, he convinced the Tsar to kind of help push Great Britain and France into not recognizing the Confederacy. He later kind of advocated to Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln later did. Not saying that Clay is the sole reason he did that, but he kind of supported Lincoln in that direction. So basically what I'm getting at is Muhammad Ali's original name was the name of a Kentucky abolitionist who spent his whole life fighting against slavery, risked his life to stop slavery, and Cassius Clay changed his name to Muhammad, who was a white man who owned slaves and had sex slaves and stuff like that. So Muhammad Ali kind of got fooled on the name thing there. But the main person credited with creating the Black Power movement was Stokely Carmichael. Now, he's a leader of SNCC, and in 1965 he and SNCC launched something called the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. This was an attempt to register voters to form a new political party in Lowndes County, Alabama. Now, this county has 80% population of black people, so 80% black, 20% white. Despite that huge majority, no black person held political office in the county. So this is why Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement says, if we are the majority, we should at least have political power. So they end up starting a political party. Their symbol is the Black Panther, and that's kind of how the Black Panther becomes a symbol of black power throughout the 1960s. So the group works throughout 1965 and 66 to register voters. While this drive is going on, James Meredith undertakes his March Against Fear walk from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi, and this is when he gets shot. So basically, James Meredith goes on this March Against Fear. He gets shot. So Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael come together to carry on this march, to continue it. But tension starts to kind of show between the two. Martin Luther King is dedicated to nonviolence, and Stokely Carmichael is less inclined to supporting nonviolent means to getting civil rights. On June 16th in Greenwood, Mississippi, Carmichael gives a famous speech called his Black Power speech. He starts saying, you know, we've been saying freedom for 6 years. What are we going to start saying now? Black power. So the old way is Martin Luther King's way. Ask for your freedom, protest for your freedom. Stokely Carmichael starts saying, stop asking for freedom and start asking for power. Power is how we get our freedom. Later in Canton, Mississippi, Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael and the marchers are attacked with police tear gas and clubs. The march does arrive in Jackson, Mississippi, and both MLK and Stokely Carmichael give speeches. Martin Luther King's followers shout "Freedom now," while Carmichael's followers shout "Black Power." Martin Luther King tells the audience, "I still have a dream that one day right here in the state of Mississippi, justice will become a reality for all of God's children. I still have a dream." Stokely Carmichael, on the other hand, says this. He tells blacks to build a power base so strong in this country that will bring them to their knees every time they mess with us. So this is kind of when the civil rights movement starts to split. Now, the Black Panthers are another group that kind of espouse black power. In 1966, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California. They borrowed the idea for their group from Stokely Carmichael's Lowndes County movement. Now, their chief spokesman and self-described Minister of Education was Eldridge Cleaver. He's kind of a shady character. He had been convicted of rape, and he often bragged about his conquest of women. Now, the Black Panthers originally formed just to keep watch over how the police treated the community. Police-community relations in Oakland, California are not very good. So what the Black Panthers do is they walk around with guns in public, and they observe police when they arrest blacks. And the Black Panthers would read blacks who were being arrested their rights. They researched the law, so they always knew what they were permitted to do. When they were challenged by authorities, they quoted the Constitution or the laws of California that said they could bear arms or be within a certain distance of any police action, so long as they did not interfere with that police action. California politicians started to introduce gun control legislation because of the Black Panthers, so the Panthers decided to protest. In May 1967, they traveled to Sacramento, California, and they actually went into the State House with loaded guns. As a result, California passed the Mulford Act, which took away a citizen's right to carry loaded guns in public. Ronald Reagan, who's going to be a conservative hero later on, he signs this into law. Now, in addition for pushing for black power and revolution, the Black Panthers also started a newspaper. They set up breakfast programs for kids that needed it in their community, and they distributed food throughout the communities. So they're kind of a revolutionary political activist organization, but then they also have social programs for their community. Now, the Black Panthers attracted a lot of youth to their cause. They used images to portray black strength. This is a famous poster of Huey Newton. He has a spear and a rifle, symbols of Africa and power. They also created a 10-point program that called for blacks to determine their own destinies. The Black Panther Party spread throughout the nation, with chapters going up in other cities. Membership rose to the thousands, but the group faced a lot of trouble. In October 1967, Huey Newton was involved in a shooting with police. He was shot, and some police officers were also shot, one of them dying. Newton was eventually convicted of voluntary manslaughter. He spent a few years in jail, but his conviction was overturned on a judge's error. In April 1968, the Black Panthers were involved in a gun battle. One Black Panther Party member was killed. Police were also shot. By 1969, the Black Panthers had broken up, except for basically in the Oakland area. Okay, so let's kind of finish up civil rights. Now, in addition to working against racism and discrimination, Martin Luther King also focused on poverty during the civil rights era. In 1967, he organized something called the Poor People's Campaign. Him and his group, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, their goal was to have another march to Washington, this time focused on poverty, not racism. Marchers would gather in Marks, Mississippi, march to Washington, and demand that Congress and LBJ take action. The Vietnam War is going on, and basically King says, we're spending all this money killing Vietnamese around the world. Why can't we spend that money on our own citizens? Now, while King is planning this People's March to Washington, he's asked to come to Memphis, Tennessee to help with a strike. There's a Memphis sanitation strike going on, so the sanitation workers in Memphis are going on strike. So Martin Luther King kind of takes a side route, goes on this side quest, and in Memphis, Tennessee, he's killed. On April 3rd, he gives a speech at a mass meeting. The next day, April 4th, he's shot by James Earl Ray at his hotel, and he dies. So Martin Luther King's assassinated in 1968. The Poor People's Campaign takes place without him, but it's kind of, since it's leaderless, it's kind of not what it maybe could have been. The movement does build an encampment in Washington, D.C. called Resurrection City, so they do march to Washington. The marchers stay there from May to June 1968. In June 1968, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. A train brings his body back from California, and it goes by Resurrection City. So two of the Poor People's Campaign supporters, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, are both killed. Congress doesn't act, and eventually the movement collapses. After Martin Luther King's death, the civil rights movement starts to lose momentum. Some of this had to do with his death. He's a very important figure in the movement. But some of the civil rights movement was made up of thousands of people at the grassroots level. So the movement doesn't just depend on one person. But it starts to break up nonetheless. Now, we kind of talked about how there's differences within the civil rights movement. Basically, blacks tend to split over issues such as continuing King's path of nonviolence and freedom, or Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers' call for black power. Many whites who support civil rights also begin to split. Issues such as busing or affirmative action split them. Here's kind of examples of that. In 1960, there was a struggle in Boston to desegregate the Boston schools. Blacks tended to live in all black neighborhoods, and whites tended to live in all white neighborhoods. So since you have neighborhood schools, the schools are also segregated just because of where people live. In 1972, the NAACP, with the support of black parents, files suit in federal court. And on June 21st, 1974, Federal District Court Judge W. Arthur Garrity rules that Boston was maintaining two separate school systems. The solution he imposed was busing, and he ruled it must begin in September 1974, so later that fall during the school year. Busing required students from all over Boston to be bused to schools across town in order to make the schools more racially balanced. This, in a way, destroyed the sense of community that existed in neighborhood schools. If your kids had gone to the local school from kindergarten through 7th grade, a school they could walk to in 5 minutes, they might all of a sudden be forced to go to a school 45 minutes across town. This occurred to both black and white students, and it was unpopular with both black and white parents. It was especially unpopular because one man, a judge, was forcing this on community. There were violent protests and boycotts of schools. I want to show you some footage. At one point, Senator Ted Kennedy gets kind of jeered by this mob. He supports busing, but he sends his kids to private schools so they don't have to deal with busing. So here's a clip.
Still confused about busing in Boston? Stay tuned for Compass Team's special on the entire desegregation story. Next. Sorry.
Good evening, I'm Ed Baumeister. This is The Week,
And this next 90 minutes is designed to give you information about what happens this week when Boston schools open under a federal desegregation order.
Those who have watched the other demonstrations and insist that this demonstration, the people seem angrier than they were in the others.
Yes, definitely. I've been on all of them for the past 9 years. And we started small and we've gotten big. And I think they are angry because we have been ignored, and school starts Thursday, and their backs are up against the wall. And this is I think, a very peaceful way of showing that all our marches have been peaceful. We have never had any trouble on any of the marches.
He knew he was in hostile territory, but never before had a Kennedy been met with such a reception in Boston. He was booed. The crowd would not calm down. They shouted at him. Some said, "Kill him." Even the speakers could not calm the crowd. The audience made the gesture of turning their backs on Kennedy. His attempt to speak failing, he left the platform. The crowd surged towards this once favorite son. It was a strange crowd to surround a Kennedy. As he walked towards the Federal Building, tomatoes and newspapers started flying, and the nonviolence stopped.
The news directors of Boston's television stations all say they are going to try to make sure that their coverage of integration this week doesn't become part of the story. All say they are conscious that the presence of newsreel cameras sometimes inspires action as well as records it. Mel Bernstein of WNAC-TV puts it this way: "We don't want our cameras to be part of the story, but we have to cover the story." That sums up the dilemma. The electronic press learned in the 60s that it could find itself being used by demonstrating groups. Things happened in front of TV newsreel cameras that wouldn't have happened had there been no cameras. Still, as WBZ TV news director Bill Wheatley puts it, it's a very difficult thing. We're going to try to be as unobtrusive and remote as possible. We are trying not to become a factor.
Another issue that kind of splits the movement is affirmative action. It will be remembered LBJ had supported affirmative action. He gave his affirmative action speak at Howard University in June of 1965. So this kind of splits whites who had previously supported civil rights. The University of California at Davis Medical School had established quotas for various minority applicants. Alan Backey was an engineer in his 30s, and he decided that he wanted to go into the medical profession. He was a white student. He was denied admission twice to University of California at Davis, even though he had higher test scores than most of the minority students who had been admitted. So he charged that the university had denied him equal protection under the law, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court in Backey v. Davis. And the court ruled in June 1978 that the university had to admit Backey. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled that the medical school's quota system did violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Justice John Paul Stevens wrote, quote, "Race cannot be the basis of excluding anyone for participation in a federally funded program." Justice Thurgood Marshall dissented, though. He said, "After several hundred years of class-based discrimination against Negroes, the court is unwilling to hold that a class-based remedy for that discrimination is permissible." Later on, in March 1972, the National Black Political Convention is held in Gary, Indiana. The convention focuses on electing black people to political office. In the 10 years after the meeting, the number of blacks elected to public office went from 2,000 to over 5,000 nationwide. Some examples: in 1967, Carl Stokes becomes the first black mayor of a top 10 American city. That's Cleveland, Ohio. In 1973, Maynard Jackson is elected the first black mayor of Atlanta. In 1983, Harold Washington's elected the first black mayor of Chicago. So though the civil rights issue is not a dead issue in America, the most successful years of the movement are the 1950s and 60s as far as overcoming segregation and discrimination. And then maybe the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, the focus is more on black power, winning elected office, things like that. Now I just want to real quick summarize, why did civil rights succeed? Why did this movement succeed? And there's a number of reasons. These are not all of the reasons, but these are just some of them. Now, so first of all, the Founding Fathers laid down principles in 1776 and 1787 that could be appealed to by civil rights activists, centuries later. The Civil War amendments put into the Constitution, though they were ignored, those were resurrected by civil rights activists in the 50s and 60s. World War II changed many people's opinion, including whites and blacks. The media helped blacks gain their civil rights by showing the nation the horrors of segregation and discrimination. Congresses passed and presidents from FDR to LBJ and even Nixon signed civil rights bills and executive orders into law. Dedicated and charismatic men such as Martin Luther King led the movement. But probably most importantly, thousands of civil rights activists and people just at the grassroots level, both black and white, people like the Little Rock Nine, people like James Meredith, they worked to end discrimination and segregation by taking bold action in their own lives and their own communities. So lots of reasons for success, but those are just some of them.